Hello, good morning. So this morning I'm going to deviate from my typical ADHD topic and talk about something that's very prominently featuring the news currently, and that is the insurgence of respiratory infections throughout our community. This is 2.5 years after the onset of the pandemic, and when it hit us, we all had to stay home and shelter, as you may remember. This seems weird to say that pandemic seems like a thing of the past already, which for the most part has been, at least in the Southern California communities. So now the main question is, why are hospitals inundated with sick people, especially sick children with respiratory infections? Aren't these viruses around, last year, the year before, and 10 years ago, 20 years ago, before there was ever, any concern about the pandemic? Yes, they're wrong. For example, the most prominently featured virus that's kind of the star of the show right now, that's stealing the thunder from COVID 19, is something called RSV. And RSV stands for respiratory syncytial virus. It's called as such because the virus causes normal cells to coalesce together and form a syncytium, kind of like what slime mold does in some situations. So what is RSV? RSV causes basically like kind of worse version of the common cold. In adults, it causes some sore throat, a lot of runny nose, and cough. Cough typically lasts a bit longer than a typical cold, sometimes over 2 weeks. But in young children, especially babies, causes symptoms as somewhat more severe. It frequently causes high fever initially, and it has a predilection of causing ear infections in children. So, from my experience, about maybe 20-30% of children with RSV end up with ear infections. So, what you really want to watch out for as parents is to watch this bimodal fever. So frequently, young children, when they first get RSV, they will have a high fever. 102, 103, those are not unusual. However, those fevers usually last for about 2-3 days and they go away. What happens with children who actually end up getting an ear infection from the RSV is that after the initial phase of fever goes away, then they have a second spike of fever. This happens 5-6 days after the initial fever, and if the children are verbal, they can actually tell you that their ear hurts, or they may make gestures, indicating that they have discomfort in their ears. So that's what you watch out for. Why do these children get ear infection with RSV infection? Well, it's because the infection has a tendency to produce large amount of mucus. It stimulates the body to produce mucus as a defense mechanism. But in the process, it plugs up the normal drainage system in the middle ear. The eustachian tubes are usually structures that will drain the middle ear. If there's any fluid that accumulates in the middle ear, it will drain them into the throat. However, with an excessive amount of mucus produced during an RSV infection, that drainage system temporarily stops working. So fluid tends to accumulate in the middle ear, and if you happen to have any traces of bacteria in the middle ear, that will frequently induce an infection. So it's nearly impossible to get an ear infection without some sort of congestion or disruption of the middle ear drainage system. And RSV set up a prime environment for that to happen. So besides ear infection, sometimes RSV can cause pneumonia in babies, but usually that's not very dangerous. It can also cause something called bronchiolitis, which causes significant amount of wheezing and sometimes difficulty with breathing. That can be more concerning in especially in babies less than 12 months old. So basically, if you find your child struggling to breathe, you don't need me to tell you that you should take your kid to the doctor. Um, and or if you see this bimodal fever distribution, if the fever initially is there, goes away for a few days, and comes back, then that's another reason to visit a doctor, is because your kid may need antibiotics for treating the ear infection. And RSV is particularly dangerous for those babies born with congenital heart disease. So these are babies whose heart is deformed in some way. Maybe the artery is coming up from the heart in a different way. Maybe there's a hole connecting between the two chambers of the heart that shouldn't be connected. So those babies, they suffer the most dangerous complication from RSV because they already have some hindrance in their regulatory circulatory flow of their blood already. So if any impact that affects airflow to their lungs, they can get extremely sick, and these babies sometimes end up on the breathing machine or even in the intensive care unit. So for these babies specifically, babies who are born extremely prematurely, so babies who are born prior to 28 weeks gestation, or babies who are born with neuromuscular conditions like muscular dystrophy or congenital heart disease, these babies, they actually receive a form of passive immunization. Um, and this is something that the doctor will usually arrange. It's not like the typical vaccine, and there's no specific routine vaccination against RSV. And the best way to prevent your child from getting sick and protect yourself also is hand washing, because RSV, unlike coronavirus, it's spread primarily by contact, and it's very effective in doing that because RSV, the virus can remain viable and contagious on surfaces for sometimes weeks at a time. This is very different from COVID 19, which is primarily transmitted through airborne uh, pathways. And RSV is very hard for RSV to spread through the airborne pathway. So wearing masks is not nearly as important to protect yourself from RSV than COVID 19. So I hope that's been helpful, and I wish your family can make it through this winter relatively unscathed. But chances are, especially if you have a child in daycare, he or she will get sick multiple times this winter. And the main reason for that is because for the last several years, everyone's been hunkered down at home. So no one has been exposed to any germs, sometimes including COVID 19. So now that they don't have this immunity that happens innately through um, being infected by respiratory viruses, so now there's a larger cohort of people who are susceptible to getting sick. That's why we're facing such a inundation of sickness in our community. All right. I hope you stay healthy. Take care.